Hello everyone, welcome to Physical Anthro Lab. Today in Lab 1 we'll be discussing anthropology in general, right? What is anthropology? We'll get into specifics of biological anthropology and then take a look at the scientific method. So the first thing we have to ask ourselves when we're into this course is, what is anthropology, right? So if we don't understand what anthropology is, it's going to be a little bit difficult to figure out what even biological anthropology is. So anthropology at its core is the study of people, right, in the past and in the present. And I like to add in throughout time and space because time and space gives us a lot of information about people, right? So the study of people in the present and in the past. And so there are two fundamental ideas to all of anthropological work. The first one is the importance of context, and then the second fundamental idea is the use of the comparative approach. And we'll go over the two of them. So the importance of context. This means the time and the space and the unique historical and environmental circumstances and various culturally specific practices, right? Our context. If you ever think back to high school and you were learning vocab and they told you to look at your context clues, it's that surrounding information. It's the same thing here, right? The surrounding information that we get when we're studying people, right? Time, space, historical events, environmental circumstances, right? That's all our own context. So context is important to all anthropological work because it shapes what we study. We as human beings, we don't live in a vacuum. So we are inseparable from the context in which we live in, right? So one example we can give you can look at is, in order for an anthropologist to fully understand you, they would need to consider your age, where you live, your gender, your life experiences, any cultural practices that you might have or you might abstain from certain things, your family, your place in the broader biological world, and many, many other factors that make you uniquely you. So they have to understand this context in order to understand you as an individual. Your cultural practice, they might impact the way that you view the world and your place in it, right? If you're in a very male-dominated culture, then you might see your place in the world slightly different than another individual from a different culture, right? Or if you're in a culture that values raising children more independent rather than dependently, you might see your place in the world slightly different, right? So our culture, it shapes the way that we think about the world and what we think our place in it is. Our own biology, such as our sex or our age, that might impact our place in the world as well. Our life experiences, they tell the story of how all of these factors are put into place. This emphasis on context and how different aspects of a study subject interrelate and impact one another is often what we call the holistic approach, right? So it's something you want to keep in mind, is this holistic approach. It's this approach that looks at everything that makes us us, right? I like to compare this to, say, holistic medicine, right? When you think of holistic medicine, you're thinking of treating not just the symptoms, but the whole individual, right? There might be, someone might be feeling sick and there might be dietary changes that are required, or diet influences that might have led to a certain ailment, right? You might be looking at environmental, right? So something in the environment can be triggering something, a reaction happening to an individual when they go see their doctor, right? Think of like allergies, right? It's your doctor might know that it's allergy season, and therefore any ailments during allergy season might contribute to their overall diagnosis, right? So that it's taking a holistic approach in medicine, whereas we as anthropologists take a holistic approach in understanding people and their cultures and their backgrounds and the individual themselves. So with this emphasis, this emphasis then is placed on seeing the whole picture, because anthropology recognizes that numerous different factors and contextual issues will contribute to what it means to be human. So that's the first one, right? The importance of context, right? The second fundamental idea in anthropology is the use of the comparative approach. So This can take many different forms, and anthropological comparisons can be the focus of a research project, or it might just be a small portion of a research project. So one example could be that an anthropologist might compare different time periods, right? They might compare a certain group of people from one time period in comparison to another time period. You can look at different regions, right? Different regions of the world and make comparisons there. Or you can also look at comparing humans to other species, right? So that is taking a comparative approach. So no matter the subject that we are looking at, we recognize the importance of considering the similarities and the differences through these comparisons, right? So those are two key things that we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about anthropological work: the importance of context and the importance of a comparative approach. So within anthropology, there are 4 different fields: cultural, linguistic, archaeology, and biological. The 4 fields are united by that consideration of culture and an emphasis on that comparative approach. They vary based on what questions they ask and what materials they study. So I like to organize them by, am I talking about the living or am I talking about the dead? And then am I talking about the recent or am I talking about the ancient, right? And it'll make more sense when we go through this. So the first one is cultural anthropology, right? This is one that you're talking about the living, right? So often if you're come from a European background or you're studying this in Europe, it might be called social anthropology. But for us in general, we'll just stick to cultural anthropology. And so cultural anthropology studies cultural practices, beliefs, economics, political events, politics in general, gender roles, things like that. They traditionally, and I say traditionally because it's been quite some time since this has changed, but traditionally they studied non-Western groups, but I'd say since the 1950s at least, or the 1940s even, it has started to change. So it's not always the case in the field today. You might get people looking at urban populations, homelessness in the United States and Western civilizations, right? It has taken a turn to look at now more, not just the other, but also the us, right? If that makes sense. Next is linguistic anthropology. This studies how people make and use language. Again, they tend to research living or recently living peoples. They traditionally will study non-Western populations. Again, there is a shift in that, right? You can look at dialects, you can look at accents, you can look at slang language, gender language, right? There's variations in that. So again, it's not just looking at the non-traditional populations. You can look at your own population, but traditionally they do look at other non-Western populations. Like our cultural anthropologists, linguists will use observations and interviews to collect data about language production and use. They can also use written documents wherever they have any available, recordings of people speaking the language that they are studying. So one example is how language is used differently by men and women in an indigenous group in New Guinea, right? That is one example that someone doing a linguistic study might look at, right? Our third field is archaeology. This is probably one that most people are more familiar with if you are familiar with like Indiana Jones, right? This is the idea and the picture of what you get in your mind if you think of anthropology. So archaeology is the study of cultural practices, economics, gender roles, and rituals. Same as cultural anthropology. They're studying the same thing. The difference here is that archaeologists will focus on people and cultures of the past. So again, it's that separation between are they living or are they dead, right? Archaeology tends to work with the dead. So sometimes they will study the distant past, sometimes tens of thousands of years ago, and sometimes they will study the recent past, maybe just a few decades ago, right? They will study both Western and non-Western peoples around the world. Unlike our cultural and linguistics, archaeology primarily examines the material remains that are left behind by people to understand their practices and their way of life, right? Again, you're working with the dead, so you're likely going to be looking at material remains like pottery shards or trash piles, right? There's this practice in archaeology where they look at you can say it's trash essentially, but they're called like shell middens and things like that. And so looking at that can give you a really good understanding of how a population lived, right? If you look at your own trash and the pile of trash that you have, you can tell a lot about a person, right? Do they recycle? Do they not recycle? Do they try to use as much of their food as possible? Or is a lot of their food processed? Is a lot of their food organic, right? You can tell a lot about a person, and that tells you a lot about maybe their nutritional status, maybe about their living style, the way that they live. Are they active people? You can infer a lot based off of our own trash. So that's archaeology. And then the last one, and the one that we're probably more concerned with in this class, is biological anthropology, right? So biological anthropology was traditionally called physical anthropology. And when I was in undergrad, this is what I called it. I went in and I was taking a physical anthro class, right? It wasn't until a little later where there was a shift into calling it biological anthropology, and it really reflects the fact that the field is so broad, right? So current trends will emphasize methods and theories from biology, things like the growing incorporation of DNA analysis. Biological anthropology is the study of human evolution, including our biology, our close primate relatives, our fossil ancestry, and our current similarities and differences, right? So there's a lot that goes into biological anthropology. Biological anthropologists will study people today and in the past, right? So here's another distinction that we're looking at. One of the things that makes biological anthropology research quite unusual among the sciences is its emphasis on that biocultural approach. So this approach recognizes that human biology and culture are closely intertwined, and they need to be examined and understood simultaneously, right? Think back to that holistic approach. It's kind of the same idea. So an example is a biological anthropologist might consider how stone tool use, which would be considered culture, right, using stone tools, how that impacted past diet and dietary adaptations. So now you're looking at biology. Or you can look at, or a biological anthropologist might look at how mating preferences, again, culture, right? Our culture will dictate what we are attracted and what we're not attracted to, and what we see as a suitable mate and what a suitable mate might not be, right? So mating preferences, how they impact current population isolation and human variation, right? That would be biology, right? So again, it's very important to remember these four fields of anthropology. And if you're going to boil it down to anything, think of cultural. We're looking at, just culture in general, politics, gender, subsistence patterns, things like that. Subsistence patterns being how we obtain food, right? Then linguistics, think language. Anything to do with language, you're thinking about linguistics. Archaeology, if you're not familiar with Indiana Jones, then think of like digging, right? Digging, looking at pottery remains, looking at, animal bones maybe that you might see because they're left in a food pile, right? Housing structures. I like to think of Pompeii in general just because it's a great archaeological site. Where it's just preserved human remains and houses and everything. So I think of archaeology in that way, if I'm not thinking about Indiana Jones at least. And then biological, right, which is what we're concerned about in this class. Think about human evolution. Think about primates. Think about human variation. And if you don't know what variation is, don't worry about it. We will get to it probably by chapter 7, I believe, or lab 7. So you don't have to worry too much about not knowing specifically what I'm talking about right now. So to get into biological anthropology, we first have to understand what it is, right? We now know that it's dealing with humans and biology and evolution and primates, right? We know it's talking about all of that. But We also have to understand that there are separate subfields within the field of biological anthropology, right? And we're going to go through each of them, quite similar to the way that we did this now, right? And we're going to look at the four, there's many different subjects, but there's four main ones that we're going to look at here, right? So there are several subfields within the field of biological anthropology, each one emphasizing a different aspect of human evolution and our place in the world, right? And I know I gave the example of, I like to think of, within the fields of anthropology, if they're dealing with the dead or the living, and it kind of made sense probably to you, and you're probably still scratching your head about it, but this is where it makes the most sense. If you're going to divide human biology, forensic anthro, primatology, and paleoanthropology, then you can see now if you can narrow it down by, am I working with the living, am I working with the dead, am I working with human, am I working with non-human? And I'll explain. So the first one's human biology, right? This is a subfield of biological anthropology. It is a broad subfield, and it includes research on human genetics, the impact of the evolutionary processes on our species, and variation among humans today. So if we take that into consideration, in this case, we are likely dealing with living subjects, right? This subfield draws heavily on theories and methods from biology. So a researcher who is focusing on the subfields of human biology might study, say, the evolution of a particular trait, right? Something like lactose tolerance or lactose intolerance. And we'll get to lactose tolerance and intolerance again in human variation, right? So if we were studying human biology and we were studying that lactose intolerance, right, we could explore the impact of different evolutionary processes in shaping this adaptation, right? Were the ancestors pastoralists, right? Did they depend on herd animals who provided dairy, right? So that's one option, right? We might also consider genetic evidence for the trait, as well as why that trait might vary in human populations today. These are just some things that we might consider if we're looking at lactose tolerance or intolerance in groups of people, right? The next one is forensic anthropology, right? Forensic anthropology, now we're thinking, are we working with the living or working with the dead, right? This is one where we're working with the dead, right? So forensic anthropology is an applied area of biological anthropology that has gained a lot of popular attention through the recent years, through shows like Bones or shows like CSI, right? Those are forensic anthro shows, right? Often it is having to do with a crime, and it often has to do with solving that crime, right? And it has to do with murder. And a lot of times forensic anthropologists do work with governments, although they're usually doing that part-time, right? A lot of the other time they're probably teaching or something or doing research. So forensic anthro, again, just think forensics. It's very easy. We will get into forensic anthro. I believe that is lab 8, I believe. So we will get to it eventually. So I don't want to go too far into discussing it because I want to keep a lot of that stuff for that lab. Our third subfield is primatology, right? And so primatology, again, we're looking at the study of apes, right? In this case, we're looking at the study of living apes. So are we working with the living or are we working with the dead? We're working with the living, right? So primatology is the study of living apes. They will primarily study, or primatologists will primarily study the differences across our different primate species. They will then try to understand how, why, and when various primate traits evolved, right? So that's what a primatologist does. They study living primates. And then the last subfield is paleoanthropology. And paleoanthropology is the study of the anatomy and the behavior of humans and our biological relatives in the past, right? So now we're going to ask again, are we dealing with the living or are we dealing with the dead? In this case, we are likely working with the dead, right? So what happens here in paleoanthropology is that it uses methods of excavation, right, that are similar to those that we use that are used by archaeologists. Often there is an overlap in the evidence used with our archaeologists. So, while the archaeologists will tend to focus on the modern human species, our paleoanthropologists will often focus on our ancient relatives, like our Neanderthals or our Homo erectus or Homo rudolfensis. Let's see, I'm trying to think of more. Australopithecines, right? They'll deal with those distant relatives, right? Our paleoanthropologists, whereas archaeologists will just work on human remains or human archaeological remains. Our paleoanthropologists will often deal with the more distant past, so they will go as far back as several million years ago, right? So that's a breakdown of biological anthropology and its subfields. Now we're going to move on to the science and the scientific method. So if we're looking at the scientific method, right? And I know that this might be review for a lot of you guys if you've taken a science class any time in the recent past, but I'm going to go over it really quickly just in case any of you guys are unsure about the scientific method in general. So the scientific method is a cycle of scientific practices. And what it does is that it helps scientists gain knowledge and sparks further scientific inquiries. So there are 4 key stages to the scientific method, right? The first one is observation. Then you've got our hypothesis. Then you've got data collection and testing. And then you've got interpretation. So I know I can say all of those to you guys, and you might have an idea of what that is, but I'm still going to go through them just to make sure. So observation, right? Observation is where a scientist can make an observation either directly or they can use observations made by other scientists as part of previous research, right? So you can either make an observation, right? You're out there, you're seeing things like in this example, you've got savanna baboons live in larger social groups than other baboon species, right? That is an observation that we might make if we're observing savanna baboons. Then you make a hypothesis, right? And a hypothesis is based on the researcher's observation, right? It is a testable explanation of those observations. So in this example, right, our hypothesis might be that savanna baboons live in large groups because they have larger protection from predators than other types of baboons that live in small groups, right? So that's the hypothesis we make for why they live in larger social groups. Then we get to data collection and testing, right? During this stage, the hypothesis is actually tested, right? The data or the evidence is collected through experiment or further observation. So what type of data are gathered and how the data is collected will depend on the hypothesis that we are testing. So that's the third step. So in this case, our data collection and testing would be to record the number of predator attacks and the resulting injuries and deaths in the different baboon group types, right? There might, depending on the results, right, it might be different for the different sizes of groups. So after we have our data collected and our testing done, right, we move into interpretation. And so interpretation is the collected data, right, we use to evaluate the hypothesis. And so what we do is we ask, did the hypothesis adequately explain the early observation? Is there sufficient data to support the hypothesis, or should the hypothesis be rejected? In this case, in this example, right, we have yes, there were more predation injuries and deaths in the baboons that lived in small groups as compared to the baboons that lived in larger groups. But what if this wasn't the case, right? What if the amount of predation injuries and the amount of deaths were the exact same, right? What would we do then, right? What we do then is we go back, right? We make a new hypothesis, right? So our new hypothesis could be something like savanna baboons that live in large groups have a wider variety for mating, right? They have better access to mates, right? That might be a new hypothesis. So then we'll go in and we'll collect the data and we're going to record the number of successful mating, just mating in general. Then we're going to look at how many of those mating instances lead to successful reproduction, right? And then we're going to take that data and we've collected, and then we're going to interpret it. And then say in this case, yeah, a larger group of baboons leads to a more successful reproductive cycle. right? And so then we've got a new interpretation, right? So anytime your interpretation leads to a no, or it doesn't lead to an adequate answer, you have to go back and rephrase your hypothesis, because you're trying to look at your observation and answer why it is why it is that happens, or why it is you see what you see, right? Sorry. So when the same interpretations then are supported by evidence from many different researchers, and they are widely accepted by the scientific community, they might then become a theory. So a scientific theory, it's not a guess anymore. It's an explanation supported by substantial evidence. However, with this, the evidence does not mean that a scientific theory is an absolute truth, right? We have to remember that it's still a theory. It could be debunked, right? So it's still open to reinterpretation and then rejection in the face of new evidence, right? So that's something that we have to keep in mind when we're looking at scientific theories. So in case you're wondering what savanna baboons looked like, here are a few savanna baboons for you guys to look at really quickly. So another thing we have to remember is that biological anthropologists are scientists, right? We apply the scientific method to questions about human biology, right? Because biological anthropologists study human biology in the context of human culture and behavior, biological anthropology is also a social science. So what is a social science? A social science is a discipline concerned with the study of human society, such as anthropology, psychology, or sociology. With that, we have to remember that there are certain ethical issues, right? Because biological anthropologists often work closely with people and other non-human primates, we have to be wary of ethics, right? In some cases, we will directly study people both past and present by methods such as collecting DNA samples, when we can then identify and compare genetic traits, right? In other research contexts of biological anthropology, we might hire local people to help observe and collect data about wild non-human primates. In still other research, biological anthropologists might conduct lab experiments with captive non-human primates, such as testing a gorilla's ability to use human-like forms of communication, right? With each of these instances, we have to be aware of any ethical issues that might emerge. So, biological anthropologists must follow ethical guidelines that outline how to work with those around them safely and fairly. So we have, from the American Association of Physical Anthropology, AAPA, we have a code of ethics. And so they are the leading professional organization for biological anthropologists in the United States, and they've outlined a code of ethics for biological anthropological work. And it includes the following guidelines. Let me see if I have them here. I don't have them readily available. 1 second. Sorry, guys. So the following guidelines for biological anthropologists to follow. So the first one is the primary responsibility of anthropologists is to the people, right? The species and the materials that they study, right? If you're studying a group of people and you're using their DNA, it's to them, right? If you're working with any primates, it's your responsibility is to them. Physical remains, right? Bones, your responsibility is to those bones, right? As well as the people that they partner with in their work. So this responsibility takes precedence over responsibilities to others, such as our funding agencies, right? So say you're being funded by the Smithsonian to conduct research on primates, right? Before our responsibilities, say, to the Smithsonian, we have responsibility to those primates that we're working with. So that's the first one. The second one is that anthropologists must not harm the people with whom they work. And I know it seems very straightforward, right? You do no harm. But a lot of times we have to be concerned with remembering that, because we might think that, we're not really harming anybody because of whatever reason, but in reality, we might be causing more harm than anything. Our third one is anthropologists must protect the anonymity of their hosts and the people providing information if those participants so desire. So if someone trusts you with their help and they want to remain anonymous, right? It is our job to protect that anonymity. The fourth one is anthropologists should also inform the people they are studying about the research and get their consent for the work in advance. Right? Consent is very important, and the consent process is assumed to be dynamic. Right? It is dynamic, it is ongoing, and us as anthropologists might need to reobtain consent as our research continues, or if our research changes over time. Right? So the AAPA Code of Ethics also recognizes that even if anthropologists are not working directly with living people, they should still obtain consent from those who own or control access to their study material. So an example here is if an anthropologist would like to examine human bones uncovered from an ancient Native American site, he or she should obtain the informed consent of the living Native American descendants to whom those remains are related to. In many cases, this consent process is mandated by state and federal law. So it's something to keep in mind, right? That the consent is very important. You need that consent in advance. I know when I did my thesis research, I had to go through a it wasn't very, but it was quite grueling internal review board process. And a lot of that had to do with gaining consent. I worked with children, so that consent was even harder to get, right? So it's very difficult sometimes to gain consent from your subjects. You can imagine how difficult it might be when you're working with primates, right? But that consent is still very important. So the fifth one is that anthropologists often develop close and lasting relationships with research participants. So it's important to be open and maintain informed consent while also respectfully discussing and agreeing on the limits of those relationships, right? So if you're an anthropologist, you are in these research settings for a long time, right? Even if you're not in there for a long time. I know I did an ethnographic film, and I developed very close and lasting relationships with the people in my film, right? And so I'm still very, very closely in contact with them. I consider them my good friends, right? So it's important to be open and maintain informed consent. And I did that. I had them sign a consent form and everything, and they knew that they were being filmed, and they knew that it was going to be, produced and widely disseminated to other people. So it's very important to make those things clear. So that's number 5. And so the last one is anthropologists must not exploit people, animals, or materials while conducting their work. They should also recognize their debt to their research participants and reciprocate in appropriate ways, right? We have to keep in mind that a lot of times our research might not have been possible without the help of the people we are studying, right? Or the help of local people to help us access, say, primates, right? We have to keep that in mind. So we are in great debt to them, right? And we have to reciprocate in appropriate ways. All right, so these are the guidelines that the AAPA put out for a code of ethics. Because most biological anthropology research is complex and it involves multiple overlapping steps, biological anthropology typically tends to work collaboratively with other researchers, right? So it's important to know that often we are working with other people, right? If you're looking at, say, some kind of emergence of a genetic disease, right? Because biological anthropologists can look at that. We can look at that, and we're going to be working with doctors. We might be looking at working with biologists and geneticists and things like that. So we know that we are working with several different fields at a time, right? It goes to that cross-cultural, studies approach to anthropology in general, right? So that's it for chapter 1, right? In the next chapter, we're going to start talking about cells, parts of the cell, protein synthesis. We're going to get into a lot of the more scientific aspects of biological anthropology.